on Friday. I want to talk about the Reconstruction period of U.S. history. And Reconstruction is just what it sounds like. It's how would the United States be reconstructed after the trauma of the Civil War? And specifically, how would the states that had left the Union, how would they be brought back into the Union? How would they regain their representation in Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives? What would that process be? There were all kinds of theories and plans during the Civil War about how this would happen. Some of the Republicans, the so-called radical Republicans, felt that the states of the South had committed suicide when they left the Union, and that the federal government, Washington, had the complete power to do what it wanted with the states of the South. For instance, lines could be redrawn in Texas to make Texas multiple states rather than one state. Um, Reconstruction, pardon me, obviously that didn't happen, but it was a very unsettled period in U.S. history, and one of the most controversial periods, and ultimately although there were some moments of hope, it was really one of the most tragic eras in U.S. history as well, but not for the reasons that it's often portrayed. I've talked a lot about memory in the course, and the Civil War is just embedded, I think, in the public memory, or false memories or mistaken memories about the Civil War. But this is even more true of Reconstruction. The memory in the Anglo world, the white world of Reconstruction, is that a vicious northern government, a vengeful northern government, came into the South and tried to punish white Southerners for a period of 10 years before white Southerners were able to regain control, their inherent right, according to this view, control of the states of the South. So Reconstruction is often remembered as a time of punishment for white Southerners, and that it ended when white Southerners regained political control over the states of the South, but within the context of the Union, within the context of the United States. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. This is a complete and utter lie. This memory of Reconstruction, in this story, the Southern whites being the victims of a vengeful Northern government. It's just not true at all. The situation was so complex, but to say that there was a vengeful Northern government is just completely absurd. Only one Southern Confederate official was hung after the Civil War. That was the commander of the Andersonville prison camp, and even that was probably a mistake. I think he was a victim of circumstances, not sadistic. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Union soldiers at Andersonville. They're horrific. They look like concentration camp victims. But it really had more to do with bad logistics than it had to do with this guy being a monster. But the point is that it's hard to talk about a vengeful North if you only have one person in the entire Confederate hierarchy, and he's very low down, executed for the Civil War, especially when you think that the Civil War killed 700,000 Americans. Jefferson Davis, he was thrown in jail for a short period, but ultimately he wasn't put on trial. And so the story is not one of Northern vengeance. Really what it is one of indecision and confusion, backlash against the attempt of Southern whites to create a new kind of labor system for African Americans in the post-slavery era through violent means. And it just is far more complicated than the simplistic story of white victimization would have you believe. Now, I'm going to talk about this in detail, so I wouldn't expect you to know this unless you had an especially good intro or 1043 or 1053 teacher. The other thing about Reconstruction, just from a technical point, in terms of teaching, usually it's either comes at the end of the first half of American history when everyone's beat, and the teacher's usually behind, or it comes at the beginning of the second half of U.S. history, and people just want to get over it quickly because they want to get beyond the Civil War. So Reconstruction often gets lost in history classes, just because of the odd division we have of dividing U.S. history around Reconstruction. But it's a very important period, although to me it's a very tragic period, because it sets up much of the racial oppression, the racial hierarchies that still exist in the United States. As I've said a couple of weeks ago, although Reconstruction killed slavery, it obviously didn't kill racism in the United States. And so now the question, after the Confederate surrender, it became, what would happen to the 4 million Americans of African descent that were now no longer slaves? What would be their fate? What would be their place in society? These folks, the vast majority of them, probably well over 90%, could not read or write because it had been illegal to teach them to read or write. They had almost no money because, of course, they had not gotten paid. So little education, little money. This is kind of a tough position to put these slaves in. One historian wrote a book called Nothing But Freedom, and that's how he kind of summed up emancipation, that's what slaves got, nothing but freedom. Not that freedom is insignificant, it was very significant, but then what's going to happen after that? And that's a story that I'm going to tell over the next couple of podcasts, and it's a story that has ebbs and flows. Now, let me just signal to you now, Reconstruction is a zigzag story. It's not a story that goes in one direction. I often think that students think that history only goes in one direction. But Reconstruction is a classic one step forward, two steps back kind of story. It has many permutations within the story. Very generally speaking, from the point of view of African Americans, after the Civil War, the situation remains very bad. There's a lot of oppression. Then, for a very brief period of time, the Northern Congress steps in, and African Americans gain the right to vote. They gain some political process. Some are in the Texas legislature, some are in the national legislature, National Congress. So for a brief period of time, African Americans gain a modicum of political rights and social rights. But by the end of Reconstruction, you have a huge white backlash, Southern white backlash, against the gaining of political rights by African Americans, and you start to see these rights disappear for almost a century until the 1950s and 1960s, a period that we call Second Reconstruction. So I just want to warn you before I start that this is not a one-way story. It's a zigzag story. As I said before, one step forward, two steps back. Very complicated. I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. But it's a very important story because without knowing what happened, if we stopped at Appomattox, which, and I have to admit, sometimes I've done that, I've run out of time or run out of energy, you don't understand the full implications of the Civil War and the post-Civil War period on race relations in the United States. To do that, you have to go in the post-Civil War period. The period that we call Reconstruction, a period that lasts from about 1865 to about 1877. The last thing I'll say is something I've said a couple times before in class. War is relatively easy. Peace is very, very difficult. We saw that in Iraq over the last decade, and we see this in the United States as well. When I say war is easy, what I mean by that is there's a clear goal to defeat the enemy. But after the war, then things become, what will happen? What is the place of these 4 million Americans who had been slaves. And the question becomes even more salient when you realize that the vast majority of whites, both in the South, of course, where they're virulently racist, but also in the North, where there's racism or at best indifference towards the fate of African Americans. So African American slaves are freed in a context which is not friendly for them whatsoever. And so it's a complicated story. It's not all grim. But on the whole, what we have during the period of Reconstruction is what one historian has called an unfinished revolution for African Americans.